So now that you've begun to explore social categories and social identity, it's time for us to take up the other major focus of this class, the way in which we'll study social categories, and that is to talk about passing. Passing is when someone is able to successfully adopt a new identity. I like this particular definition of Marcia Dawkins that I've put on the screen, where she says, passing is the phenomenon in which a person gains acceptance as a member of social groups other than his or her own. And it's that acceptance piece that I want to stress. That's what makes passing successful, is if somebody is able to be recognized as part of a group to which they formerly did not belong. Passing is a phenomenon in American society largely because we have such distinct social categories. There are clear boundaries. Oftentimes these identities are framed as binaries. You have this or that, men or women, black or white. And that's what makes the boundaries between these categories difficult to negotiate and requires a certain level of subterfuge or deception in order to convince folks in a particular group that you belong to that group. Many people have had to hide where it is they're coming from. You live in an era where people are much more open to having multiple identities, to having shifting identities. One of the things I hope you'll understand by the time we get to the end of this course is that is an incredibly recent development. It is something to which you, particularly if you're young, have access to that earlier generations generally did not. The census, for example, did not allow someone to choose multiple racial identifiers until the year 2000. And even in this most recent census in 2020, there was an attempt to include more inclusive gender categories, and that failed. So now, if you do the census, you have two options. You can pick male or female and nothing else. So these kind of rigid boundaries have existed throughout American history, and that's left people who are seeking other options or want to live in the world in a different way to have to hide where they came from and pass as something else. So in order to help you start thinking about passing in an academic way, I'm going to give you three broad categories, three different types of passing that you're going to encounter in this course. First up, we have the category that I call undercover passing. This is where an individual presents themselves as a member of a different group in order to explore something that would otherwise be hidden from them. Journalists, of course, are the master of this particular category. And Nellie Bly, who you see pictured here, is one of the pioneers of this type of what we call investigative journalism. In the late 1800s, so the late 19th century, Nellie Bly presented herself as someone suffering from a mental illness in order to be ensconced in what was then called an insane asylum, or as you see here, the title of her book, a madhouse. What she was able to learn going in not as a journalist, but as someone who suffered from mental illness, is just how terribly folks who'd been institutionalized were being treated. And her expose of the horrendous conditions in which these folks lived led to substantial reforms. I can come up with many more examples. This one's from the 20th century. Gloria Steinem, who many of you will know as one of the feminist icons of the 1970s and beyond, was a reporter in the early 1960s in New York, and she passed herself off as a young aspiring actress to get into the Playboy clubs of that period and work as a Playboy bunny in order to experience the exploitation that women experienced in these institutions. She wrote a 2-part article series called A Bunny's Tale. And I have a link to that and some other resources in the page that follows this video. There's also kind of a fun episode of Drunken History that recounts her passing herself off as something other than an investigative journalist in order to expose conditions inside Hugh Hefner's Playboy clubs. This particular category are folks who are going in pretending to be something else in order to get the story, understand and experience the world from a different point of view. Their intent is never to stay, and when they come out the other side, they make their experiences quite public. That means we have some great sources from folks who did this kind of passing, and we will certainly explore some of them in the class. The second broad type of passing that I want to talk about I think of as the bettering your life category. And I break this down into 2 not entirely distinct subcategories. Some folks who are seeking to better their lives by passing for a different social identity are looking to escape conditions in which they've been living. For other folks, it's more about accessing privileges and resources and experiences on the other side of these social boundaries. And those 2 things can be tied together. So 2 quick examples of that. You have a woman on the right who disguised herself as a man in order to fight in the Civil War, and she actually fights alongside her husband and watches him die in battle. The image on the left is from a movie made in the 1930s in which one of the subplots of the film is a very light-skinned African-American daughter who's raised in a white household under generally quite good and accepting conditions, but she decides she's unwilling to settle for what the world is going to hand her as an adult African-American woman. What that means for who she could marry or what jobs she could have, so she instead chooses to pass for white. And her mother, if you can't tell from this still, is quite distressed at this decision. The third type of passing might be one with which you're already familiar. This is the kind of passing where someone is trying to actually express who they feel they are on the inside. They're trying to be their authentic self. This is often the explanation for passing that we associate with transgender individuals. I've put an image of Kate Warnstein up here because she's a very public figure who has written about and reflected on that process of trying to pass as a boy when she was a child, but really felt like a girl on the inside, and later, after getting gender confirmation surgery, trying to pass as a woman and finding that that was somewhat uncomfortable too. So she's kind of labeled herself, as you see from her book, a gender outlaw and moved away from that. But her experiences talk about really that process of trying to match who she thought she was on the inside with how she was understood by society on the outside. So hopefully these 3 categories give you some idea of the broad and complicated paths that folks follow in passing, the many different motivations they have for undertaking passing. We're going to take up the study of passing in order to understand elements of all 3 categories. Maybe at the end of the session we'll want to reframe those categories, add more. But in general, we're looking at passing as a way to help us understand social categories in American society, how they are constructed, how they're policed, what privileges, identities, stereotypes, assumptions are attached to each of these categories, really how they work to shape people's daily lives. We're often going to emphasize history in this study. We're going to be specific about time and place for when and why people are passing, because these social categories change over time. So while the specific meanings for different social identities has shifted, I'm going to suggest to you that many of the mechanisms that signal what the categories are, that help reinforce these categories, that pass them down through the generations, those remain fairly resilient. If we use history and understand these things in the past, where we have a little bit of distance, I'm going to suggest that you might better be able to apply that kind of analytical thinking to look at the world in which you live and see how constructed the social categories that function in your life are. I also think it's important to understand the history of social categories, because history creates long shadows. If you're young and have a fairly open view of social identity, you need to know that you live in a world where your parents' generation and your grandparents' generation probably don't have quite such an open and flexible idea of identity. And so understanding where the categories you live under came from can be empowering in talking to other generations, but also potentially empowering in redefining and looking critically at the world in which you live. So to conclude, I do want to give you a few ground rules as you go out to explore passing in its many different forms. I very much expect that you will go into these stories, into these lives, being open and curious. Folks lived in different times, different places, and under different rules. So our job is to go in and understand what those rules were, what the forces were that shaped people's experiences, that constrained their choices. I want you to assume that social identity is real, meaning even if it isn't written down somewhere in law, even if we sometimes use different words for it, our society has been organized around particular groupings, and we've applied certain meanings to those groupings. That means there are real consequences to who gets this identity placed on them versus that identity. And then finally, I want you to embrace the nuances, the specificity. Try not to say, well, back then, or it was always this way. We're trying to be good scholars, which means we need to look at the evidence, read it for what it has to tell us, corroborate it, compare it, sift it, and sort it in order to build a good sense of what the patterns were, why they were significant, and how they functioned. So I'd encourage you to check out some of the links that I've included on the page with this video, explore a few of these stories a little further, and then dig into the material for next week where we actually start